The story of the chicken, as Bertie mentioned, is one that you think, well, everybody knows. What's important about a chicken? Why do we care about chickens? I mean, yes, they are cute. It was Easter, you know, so it's a kind of a symbol we know of fertility even today, but it really is an indispensable animal. Of course, it's the world's most common bird. I mean, there's no other wild bird that surpasses the numbers of chickens. And the numbers of chickens, of course, is rapidly changing as we eat them and as we continue to breed them. It's also the most engineered animal in human history. There's no other animal that has been so bred and crossbred, and some would say overbred or industrialized than the chicken. And it's also humanity's most important source of protein. Pork, beef, vegetable protein really doesn't come close when it comes to sheer mass of protein that the chicken provides humans every day. So I got interested in this story because I was doing a story for Smithsonian about Indians in the Bronze Age sailing to the coast of Arabia. And I'd heard that they had found in the archaeological dig there a chicken bone. And I got interested. I mentioned it to one of the editors, and they said, "Oh, now that's interesting. Write the story about the chicken." And I'm like, "No, I don't do livestock. I'm a science writer." And he said, No. Just find out, what is a chicken?" And from that very simple question, I was launched into a multi-year, round-the-world research effort to really sort out what this animal is, what was it, why was it domesticated, where was it domesticated, and then ultimately how it became this animal that is almost invisible in our lives, even though it's so present. There's a great quote from Donna Haraway, who's a sociologist who's been very interested in the chicken, called "Follow the chicken and find the world." So that's what I set out to do. The chicken, in a way, is a marker for humans. So if you understand the evolution of the chicken, you really can understand a lot about our own species. So that was the idea that I had in launching into this project. 60 million years of evolution have brought us to the chicken today. And it's true that Tyrannosaurus rex is the direct ancestor of today's chicken. And this is kind of a silly drawing, but it gives you the sense that dinosaurs, who of course came long before humans, actually were the ancestors of many birds, but particularly the chicken. They know from genetic analysis that the chicken maintains quite a number of genetic material that you find in chickens today. So let's talk about the wild chicken. We all know that the wolf, for example, is the wild dog. But can you name what is the wild chicken? So to do that, let me back up a little bit and talk about the scientific term Gallus gallus, which is the kind of the family of birds. And this includes both today's domesticated chicken as well as the wild chicken. But what is the wild chicken? Well, there are 4 varieties of jungle fowl, what are called jungle fowl, across Asia. And I'll get into some detail about that. Basically from Indonesia all the way to the foothills of the Himalaya, you find different kinds of jungle fowl. And this is where the chicken comes from. But there's still quite a bit of controversy in the scientific community about where domestication took place, why, and who did it. So this is something that I explored that I'll talk a little bit about based on some recent finds. So here are the 4 jungle fowl. The most prevalent one is the red jungle fowl, and that's the one in orange there, which stretches all the way from northern China down to Southeast Asia, into parts of Indonesia, and then as far as I mentioned, as far as the foothills of the Himalaya. It still exists today. It still has a similar range from the range it had many thousands of years ago. There's also other kinds. It's a green jungle fowl, which is located further on some of the islands south of Borneo in today's Indonesia, and the Sri Lankan jungle fowl, which is its own version only found on that island, and then the gray jungle fowl, which is found on the subcontinent of India, with maybe a little bit over, it doesn't show there, a little bit into Pakistan. But these are the 4 wild creatures from which today's chicken came from. But the question is, well, which one? And this is really important because if you want to understand the origin of the chicken and how it became domesticated, then understanding these varieties is really critical. And scientists have been arguing over this for 150 years. I know it might not sound quite believable, but this has been a very hot topic in scientific journals for a very, very long time. Now, archaeology in recent years has really been able to add a lot, along with the advances in genetic analysis, because find a chicken bone, that'll tell you a lot, right? You can tell a chicken bone. If you find a chicken bone, it's a chicken, right? If it's a red jungle fowl, it's a red jungle fowl. So then you know. Well, actually, no. The challenge is to tell the difference between the bones of a chicken and a red jungle fowl, the domesticated versus the non-domesticated version. And this isn't as easy as it sounds, because these animals are so similar in their skeletons that it's very difficult to tell the difference. In 2014, there was a scientific paper published in the very prestigious journal, PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, based here in Washington, by several Chinese authors. They claim to have found 10,000-year-old bones from northern China. Now, this was a shocker because, number one, northern China is far away from the area that the jungle fowl, particularly the red jungle fowl, are known to live in. And second, that's a long time ago. 10,000 years ago, that's even before the domestication of rice in China or in Southeast Asia. So a lot of people were suspicious of this, but it got headlines and was really widely trumpeted around the world as proof that the chicken came from China. But in subsequent years, there was a lot of debate about this and reanalysis, and now there is a belief that, in fact, these bones were not of Gallus gallus. They're not even wild bird. They're not even the wild version of the chicken. They're, in fact, a kind of pheasant. So this tells you that the problem, because these bones look so similar, and people have been so excited to find bones from ancient chicken that sometimes they find bones and they presume that they're chicken. So this is what creates a lot of debate in the scientific community, and why finding a chicken bone, which we think would be a really boring thing to do at an archaeological dig, can actually make or break careers. The other issue is that the wild bird, say the red jungle fowl, and today's domesticated chicken, they can crossbreed, and they have for thousands of years. So you start with, okay, so you have your wild bird, you domesticate the chicken out of, say, the red jungle fowl, which is most likely the ancestor of today's chicken. But then that chicken in your barnyard, in your village, say in Southeast Asia, wanders off into the woods and meets up with a wild jungle fowl, and next thing you know, there's an egg, and there's a chicken that is bred between these two, that shares this genetic material. So it's extremely difficult to follow this quite complicated genetic pattern that is created by this crossbreeding between the wild birds, which of course still exist, as I mentioned, and those that are domesticated. And this has been going on for thousands of years, so that complicates it even more. It's not just something that's happened in the past century or two. So these problems give you an idea of the extent of the difficulty in trying to pin down what would seem to be very easy, answering the question, when and where did the chicken get domesticated? Some of the ideas that have emerged in the past few years are quite interesting. It seems that, based on new genetic studies, that the heartland of the original domesticated chicken was somewhere in this area between northern Vietnam, northern Thailand, and southern China, Yunnan province. We don't know beyond that because it's simply hard with genetic data to nail down a specific spot, but you do get the sense of the general region. There's evidence from a site in Thailand called Bon Nan Wat, which I visited actually before this find happened. It's an incredible Iron Age village where you have a cemetery with lots and lots of human remains, but they've also found some evidence of what most archaeologists accept are chicken bones that seem to come from around 1500 BC. So to put that in context, the pyramids are built in Egypt in around 2500 BC. You get your first domestication of rice in China probably between 2000 and 1500 BC. So this is at a time when in Southeast Asia and in southern China, you're getting your first settlements, your first villages. People are settling down. So this is key to understanding the chicken's secret. Now, it's almost certainly tied with the rise of rice farming. And the reason is this, that chickens, they're very skittish, wild chickens, and even domesticated chickens of the old variety. They don't like to be around people. They're afraid, they're chicken. They'll run away if you come near them. They're not like a dog that will run up and want to be petted. But these chickens, probably in these early villages, would show up. These are wild birds, right? And they're showing up on the outskirts of these new farms that are developing, and they're not eating the rice. What's interesting is that the wild chicken, as well as many domesticated varieties, prefer to eat weeds and bugs. And these are the two pests that farmers hate the most. So you see, in a way, the chicken is probably like the cat. The cat was not domesticated. And how many people here have a cat? Birdie, I know, does. You know that they're so wild in a way, unlike, say, a dog. And chickens are similar because cats showed up in the Middle East when the first grain was grown and stored. Because, of course, stored grain draws rats. The cats then are following the rats. And people may not really like the cats, and the cats may not like the humans, but they both have something in common. The humans want to keep the grain from the rats, and the cats want the rats. This is what's called a commensal relationship. Different from, say, the dog, where you are the top dog, and then you tell your dog what to do. You don't tell your cat what to do, right? So the same applies almost certainly to chickens. So chickens were showing up. They weren't competing with humans for the food. They didn't want the rice. They wanted to get rid of those noxious weeds and those noxious pests. And so the farmers were happy to have them around. And this, of course, then helped from an evolutionary perspective to increase the reason for chickens to hang around. So those chickens that hung around were getting fed. Humans didn't bother them. And this created then a kind of a force of domestication, although domestication is not quite the right word in this sense. It's more commensal. One thing that I was extremely surprised by was this fundamental question of why did people domesticate the chicken? And you ask people, and of course, meat and eggs, right? Well, guess what? No. Chickens were very scrawny. As I mentioned, they're kind of hanging around the fields, they're eating some weeds, they're eating the bugs. They're scrawny. They're not something that people were seeking to eat. There were other better birds to eat than the chicken. So why would people want them around other than the fact that they are good for farmers? And that detail is really important in understanding the spread of chickens. When I went to Southeast Asia, I went to Bali and a number of places in India as well as in Vietnam. I went to lots of cockfights. In fact, I went to the World Slasher Cup in Manila, which takes place in an enormous coliseum. They have giant screens in a coliseum. It's like going to watch a boxing match, except there are like 250 cockfights that happen over the course of 3 or 4 days. And this coliseum is packed, all on the big screen. The fights last for 2-3 minutes. The birds have blades attached to their talons, and so, they don't go on very long. But the important thing to know is that although today it's entertainment, and here in the United States, among a lot of Hispanics, it's still a popular pastime. In fact, on the White House lawn during the years of Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1840s, there were cockfights on the White House lawn. So this is something that almost every culture that has chickens has had cockfighting. But it began not as a sport, it began as a religious ritual. And the example I'm showing is here in Bali. It's one of the few places in the world where you go, when they have a cockfight, it is said to be done, at least, I won't say it's done because, but it's said to be done because in order to perform a ritual, a Hindu ritual of the sort they do in Bali, you need to soak the ground in blood. Now, it would be controversial to do that with humans every time you wanted to have a prayer service. So instead, they use cockfights. So the men will bring out their birds, they will fight, and then afterwards, people will gather and perform their religious ritual. And almost certainly, this is where the spread of chickens began in Southeast Asia, not as, hey, I've got this chicken I want to sell you so you can put it in your pot. Rather, these chickens, these cocks in particular, were highly specialized creatures that had a religious purpose. And then gradually they became very valuable, so people were trading them. I'll trade my beautiful cock over the mountain for yours. And in this way, the chicken began to spread from this heartland in northern Southeast Asia. This is a theory, but it seems to fit with all the data that we have to date. And it also gives you a sense that the chicken was not something that was viewed as just an animal that was just simply for protein. This was a sacred bird that also performed this entertainment and gambling purpose as well. So let's get back to where the chicken came from. Recently, there was evidence. It was a couple decades ago. Some bones were found in Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro was this great city of the Indus civilization, which is in that area in northwest India and in Pakistan, where the Indus River flows. One of the great civilizations after Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. So this was a massive civilization, and of course people have said, well, they must have had chickens. There was a very urban situation. They needed the protein, and in fact, chicken bones were found at this site, but then recently, again, as in China, guess what? Nope, they're wild birds. Almost certainly were wild birds. The latest evidence shows that it was around 1500 BC, which of course, remember, that's probably the same era that you're finding the first domesticated chickens in Southeast Asia. So there are a couple ways of thinking about this. Either this was a separate domestication. We've got 1,000 miles of jungle between the Indus and Southeast Asia, but nevertheless, it's possible that people were trading prize cocks across village to village to village, and so over the course of centuries, maybe they reached the Indus, or maybe it is just coincidental second domestication. That's something that is still hotly debated, and of course there are these nationalistic views that get put into this. The Indians want to be the people who invented the chicken, the Chinese want to be the people who invented the chicken, the Thai want to be the people who invented the chicken. So with archaeology, you always get politics, and this is part of the politics. So whenever you read a paper about the chicken, note, who are the authors, where do they come from, and are they pushing something that might support the nationalist agenda of whatever country they're from. This is just a natural human part of science, just something to be aware of. I mentioned that I had gone all the way to Oman, to the coast of Arabia, in order to see this chicken bone that this Italian team had uncovered, only to be told when I arrived, flying to Oman, renting the car, driving all the way to the coast, and the Italians were just coming off of their daily swim in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, and they came out in their Italian bathing suits, and I was like, hi, so here I am, and I was like, well, how about that chicken bone? And the Italian archaeology director said, oh, no, chicken bone? What do you mean? I said, yeah, the chicken bone. It was in the archaeological report. He said, oh, no, that was from a worker's lunch. So it wasn't even an ancient chicken bone. It was something that had got mixed up in the dig in the course of them pulling together the artifacts that they had uncovered. So again, it just shows you that it's not as easy as it seems to find the origin of the chicken. Now, it does seem pretty clear, though, that the chicken, whether or not it was domesticated in India first or at the same time as in Southeast Asia, but at some point it did reach the Indus because we know that it moves its way up to Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia, the first great civilization, Ur was one of the major capitals at the head. So the chicken had to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which it would probably find difficult to do today, but then it was a little bit easier. And it moved up into Mesopotamia in the upper left there, and then eventually it's called the bird of Malua in these Mesopotamian cuneiform texts, which most scholars believe Malua was their term for India. So a lot of people believe that maybe around 1500 or so, again, that magic era, that it begins to appear in Southwest Asia. Now we know that by 1450 BC, so not long after, the Egyptians are bragging about the bird that they've captured during a campaign to put down Babylon. They call it the bird that lays eggs daily. Now we don't have a clear picture of it, but it's written in hieroglyphics, and it was clearly part of Thutmose the third's zoo, he had a zoo of exotic animals, as one does when you're a pharaoh, right? And you control large swaths of the world. So the chicken was probably captured in Mesopotamia, brought to Egypt as a spoil of war, and carried in this parade, which we do have textual evidence of, this like vast parade that went on for days where they carried all the booty. And among the booty was a cage that was carrying what almost certainly was the first domesticated chicken to reach Egypt, to reach Africa. Now we start to get glimpses of the ancient chicken, actual pictures up there, the top left. I love this. Isn't it a beautiful little drawing of the chicken? It's maybe the oldest one we have, and it's from an area near Akhenaten's tomb that was found by Howard Carter, the famous guy who found King Tut's grave. And it's probably around 1300 BC, but it was found out of context, just like it was just kind of sitting there on the surface. They picked it up. So we don't know for sure, but it's probably from that era. So it's just a really lovely image of what clearly is a domesticated chicken, because you don't have jungle fowl in Egypt. They don't exist naturally. So that's a sure bet. And then there's this wonderful copper plate. You see it at the top right there. You'll see images that look very much like chicken. This is from Telbasta. It's a silver bowl around 1200 BC. So you're starting to get images, and then things get exciting, because what I discovered was that the chicken is sacred not just for those people who were performing cockfights in Bali. It was sacred in the East and the West. And this is extraordinary that this one animal has very, very similar symbology throughout the ancient world. In China, as many of you probably know, it's a symbol of virtue, of fortune. It wards off evil spirits, and it's uncanny that in ancient Persia, this was for the ancient Zoroastrians, it was really the most important animal. There are hymns written to the rooster. Why? Because the rooster crows before dawn. Before there is light in the sky, the rooster crows, which is annoying to any of you who have lived in places with roosters. But at the time, this was considered, like, wow, how does it know? And so they were considered, these roosters were considered harbingers of the light, harbingers of good. And Zoroastrian tradition, which leaked into Christian tradition, as we'll see, really took the chicken very seriously. This was a bird that was quite sacred. It was not eaten as far as we know. It actually was primarily seen as an animal. Maybe they used the eggs, but it was not a meat animal. It was a sacred bird. Ancient Greece, it was a symbol of courage associated with healing and motherhood. And also, I should mention, ancient Rome, chickens were used, if you wanted to go to war, note to White House, if you want to go to war, you have a pen of sacred chickens, and you would feed them, and based on how they fed and how often they would eat, if you kept feeding them, that would determine whether or not it was auspicious for you to go to war. And this is like at the height of the Roman Empire. So maybe they fared better than we do in terms of making sensible decisions about warfare. But in any case, throughout the ancient world, the chicken, again, was not just a bird that you ate. In fact, the Romans, while they did begin to love roast chicken, it still was considered highly sacred. Here's some images that I took. I went to all these museums all over. And all over the world, I went to museums, I would just look at everything, and the chicken just pops up everywhere. It's amazing. Nobody has collected this. I wish some PhD student maybe here would like to do that. But here's an example from some Greek vases where you see the chicken prominently displayed. Again, the red jungle fowl is not native to Europe, so to see it in a European context makes it clear this is a domesticated chicken that probably came from Persia. For the Greeks, it also had this very sexual connotation. And there are all these crazy statues. I mean, look at this, the bottom left there. These associations which are kind of hard now to untangle. There's not a lot of textual evidence, but we do know that roosters were associated with fertility and sex and kind of aggressiveness as well. And you find there's an island in Greece that has lots of these. Which, again, scholars have kind of ignored because, it's just weird, right? Which to me is fascinating. So the chicken, the Christians may not have liked to talk about sex much, but the chicken retained its importance as a sacred bird. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory said it's the most suitable emblem of Christianity. And this bird here, it's a picture I took in a museum in Rome, that actually sat on top of the St. Peter's that was torn down to build the big one that now exists. Pope Nicholas said that every church should have a rooster on top. So if you've ever wondered why every church has a weather vane shaped like a rooster, it's not because, somebody was churning them out in a warehouse and just convinced them to buy, hey, isn't it a cool weather vane? This is because a pope ordered it, because again, as was the case in ancient Persia with the Zoroastrians, the rooster was seen as a sign of the coming of the light, the coming of Jesus in the case of Christianity, and so it was a highly important symbol. And so to see that rooster when you walk by church, it meant wake up. It was a call to wake up. It was like, getting hit on the head by a Buddhist monk at certain monasteries I've been to when you fall asleep. It's like, wake up, pay attention, because Jesus is coming. And so even today, you will see roosters all over. Trust me, you will start seeing them everywhere now after this lecture. The longest chicken journey is one of the most fascinating. Going the other way, so we've gone from Southeast Asia to Europe, but the chicken went also from Southeast Asia in the other direction. It went toward Polynesia. And who took them? Of course, the Polynesians. So the Polynesians, when they left probably the area of the Philippines or Taiwan, and this would have been, maybe around 1000 BC, it's a little unclear, but they took with them a few things. They took a package. They had a boat. What do you put on your boat if you're going to go across a big ocean? You want to have a dog, right? You want to have rats because they breed and, they're yummy if you're, used to that kind of thing. And the chicken. So these were the three parts of the Polynesian package, Lapita package is the technical term, that was carried across the ocean, one of the greatest journeys of the ancient world, where these people got in boats and they really were incredibly skilled in navigation, and they were smart enough to take what they needed, to only what was most essential, and the chicken was essential. So if you find an ancient chicken bone in Polynesia, you know that somebody carried it across long distances across the ocean for it to get there. Now, the big question, and I have a chapter in my book about this, is did the Polynesians get to South America? Because if you found a pre-Columbian, that is a before 1492 bone in South America, that would prove that Columbus, who brought chickens, we know he brought chickens, but that would prove the Polynesians actually got to the Americas first. So it's a marker. You see how the chicken is an important marker in Pacific archaeology to determine where people were. You find it, human bones, harder to find. Chicken bones, a little more common, right? People weren't burying them or burning them. They were just throwing them out. So if they survive and you find them, they can be an important way of understanding when people reach certain islands in the Pacific. So the island hopping can be charted in large part by the chicken bones that are now being found. So this is the big mystery. There is a 2nd century BC ceramic vessel in Lima that I saw right here that I took a photo of. Maybe it's not a chicken. There's no telling. It's just an image. It could be a fantasy of, a sacred sunbird, right? But looks a lot like a chicken to me. But again, that's just the kind of little thing that you can find that raises deeper questions that we still don't have answers for. There are early mentions of chickens by the Spanish, who said they encountered chickens. So that's also an interesting piece of evidence. But the only real archaeological evidence that we have is from a place in Chile on the coast where these researchers dug up, a whole chicken, the bones, right? And they dated it, sure enough, 1450-ish AD, okay? So before Columbus. Big paper, went out, big splash around the world, and then the controversy broke out. Because there's something called the marine effect. So when you date something, for example, if that chicken had eaten fish, then the dating, the radiocarbon dating that's commonly used, gets fuzzy. Because marine material could be very, very old, right? That fish has carbon that might date back thousands of years. So you can get a false reading if that chicken has eaten fish. It's like, okay, it's complicated. And so it's still unclear, and this has been 15 years since this was found, it's still debated whether or not this, in fact, is a pre-Columbian chicken. If it is, it proves definitively that Polynesians arrived in the Americas before Europeans. Of course, the indigenous people have been there a lot longer than anybody, but the point is it really gives us a different picture, potentially, of the Polynesian expansion and really puts it, highlights it in a way that it hasn't been. So we'll see. The jury's still out, and there's still a couple of people who won't talk to each other because they're, my data is right, your data is wrong. There's really hardcore scientific bad feeling about this find. But we'll see if we can find another example that is away from the coast, that the marine effect is not part of it, then we might have that answer. So again, you see how the chicken is really telling us more about humans than it is about the chicken. Now, to move to more modern times, you might not know that Queen Victoria is largely responsible for the chicken dinner you may have after this talk. And that is because a man named Captain Edward Belcher, which if there are any Chinese scholars here who know their Chinese history, this is one of those bad British captains who showed up during the Opium War and decided that, we should own this. He's the one who's responsible for Hong Kong becoming a protectorate of Britain. And when he wasn't surveying Hong Kong and doing his imperialistic thing, he was gathering chickens in their voyage that went through Indonesia and then up to China, southern ports of China. Now, when he came back, and it's very hard to know where he got these chickens because he didn't keep good notes, which annoyed the hell out of me when I was writing this book. But we do know what happened later, and that is that a carriage rolled up at Windsor Castle in the 1840s and deposited a cage filled with these really cool-looking chickens that were unlike anything that had been seen in England. Because remember, in England, they had these little scrawny chickens that were very hardy, but they didn't have much meat, they didn't lay many eggs. Chickens were not what you had for Christmas dinner. You had turkey, there were other better things than chicken to eat. But Victoria was entranced by these beautiful, weird, exotic creatures, which were called the Cochin, Chinese chicken, although probably a lot of these came from Indonesia, actually. And she had a little farm there at Windsor Castle where she began to grow these, and she would spend time there after her husband Albert died. Tragically, she spent a lot of time with the chickens, and it became a thing, like Christmas trees. Her husband introduced the Christmas tree to England, that became a thing. The chickens suddenly became popular. It became popular like tulips became popular in Holland in the previous centuries. These chickens were selling for thousands of pounds per chicken. They were so hard to get. So there was what was called hen fever. It actually got to America and up and down the East Coast, particularly in New England. It was this mad rush to see who could buy the most exotic chicken and then who could sell it for the most amount of money. And it became a speculative bubble. Not as dramatic as that of the tulips, which crashed the Dutch economy, but it was big enough that when the crash came and suddenly everyone's like, why am I spending this kind of money on a funky looking chicken? When the crash came, they had to figure out something to do with these birds. And so that's when farmers in the US in particular and in Britain began to breed them with English chickens and American varieties. So you have the scrawny but tough chickens of Europe that were breeding with these exotic, more delicate but bigger, fatter birds from Asia. And that is what created our modern chicken. It's hardy, but it's also meaty. And so it was this meeting of East and West during this imperial British time that gave us the varieties that led to the modern chicken. And I'll just mention this briefly. Don't forget Darwin. Without the chicken, Darwin almost certainly would not have come up with the theory of evolution maybe as quickly. He went to the Galapagos, he looked at those finches, you all know that story, the beak of the finches, but he really studied the chicken. He was getting people, naturalists all over the British Empire to send him samples of red jungle fowl, green jungle fowl, Sri Lankan jungle fowl, and the gray jungle fowl. And he was examining those, looking at then the chicken, trying to figure out how it evolved, how they were different, where the chicken came from. And it was partly Darwin's obsession really with chickens. I mean, he was like writing letters to people everywhere saying, send me your chickens and I will pay for the postage, which was a lot of money. And so I actually went to the museum, and the storage facility for the Natural History Museum in London, you know, it's like way out in the middle of nowhere outside of London, and it's this massive warehouse. And the woman, when I showed up, she said, chickens? She said, no one ever wants to see Darwin's chickens. And so she was delighted to show me the hundreds of samples they still have. And there's a little note written in his own hand showing that he really spent a lot of time examining the chicken to understand evolution, because he understood that the domestication process was key to understanding evolution, and that breeding was, you know, a key to understanding natural selection. And then we get to the industrial chicken. I'll just mention this briefly. I mentioned already that we have a hardier, meatier version of East and West coming together. There were technical innovations in the late 19th century as industrialization has happened, and you're getting these, you know, very, very enormous cities for the first time that are spreading across America and Europe. And this is what really put the chicken into the category of cheap protein. Not sacred, not for cockfighting, but for feeding people at a time when protein was hard to come by in these dense urban conglomerates. And New York became the first chicken town. A lot of the chicken markets that developed there, these kosher chicken markets from the early 20th century, really were the first time that the chicken became a common table bird, if you will, as they began to be bred, particularly down in Delaware and the Delmarva Peninsula, and then shipped to New York. So today, Americans eat almost 100 pounds a year. And, you know, that chart just gives you a sense of how the use of chicken has grown, you know, hugely compared to beef, which has dropped off a bit, pork, which has remained kind of steady, turkey and fish are kind of minor by comparison. So this gives you a sense, and this is happening around the world. Mexicans eat 438 eggs on average a year. It's tremendous numbers. And then, of course, in China, South America, Africa, and also I should mention in Arabia, Saudi Arabia now has a huge chicken industry that is feeding that part of the world. So this is now very big business. But of course, cheap protein comes at a very steep price. I went to some of these places, you know, and I have to admit, I still will eat chicken, but it's hard to go into these places and after what you know about the history of the chicken and how much it's been an animal that has served us, like, say, the cat or the dog, and to see how we actually don't consider them to be animals under federal law. There is no law that says you can't do that to a chicken because it's not considered an animal, unlike pigs or cattle, which, of course, are more mammals, more like us. Health and welfare issues I don't need to go into. It's gruesome. The manure pollution is a huge issue around the world. What do you do with this very, very toxic manure? And then, of course, there are low-wage and high-risk jobs that are associated with this industry, particularly in the United States, that make it you know, a very controversial business indeed. If I had a chicken agenda, I'd say set some standards. When you go to the store and you buy an organic chicken, that means almost nothing. It says nothing about the way the animal was treated. You buy those free-range eggs, well, guess what? Chickens aren't humans. If you put them in a cage, we know from research they're happier than if they're in a massive floor where the territory is unclear and they're constantly in aggressive modes. So we tend to buy things that make us feel better. I think it'd be great if we use the science to set some standards so that consumers can make informed choices. You know, if I'm like, okay, I'm willing to pay more if I know the chicken actually has had a better life, but now you really don't know. You're making a choice that makes you feel better, which is fine. I do it too. But I think it'd be great if the federal government would get together some standards that would make it simpler for us to make our decisions and have the price change accordingly. You know, the backyard chicken movement is great. I don't recommend roosters in your backyard here at DuPont Circle, but it certainly, I think, reminds people, you know, how fascinating these creatures are. If you know anybody who has chickens, and I don't have chickens, I have friends who have chickens, and that's what I recommend. But it is important for particularly children, to have contact with animals, farm animals. And the chicken is something you can manage in a suburban environment, which you can't do in the case of a pig or a cow. There are also non-industrial varieties. The French are very good about really guarding, really being sure that that nasty industrial chicken that came out of America in post-World War II does not dominate. But it is spreading around the world. When I was in Vietnam, even in remote parts of northwest Vietnam, you were starting to see the beginnings of this industrial chicken showing up. And these older varieties, some of which are fascinating, some are like they've been bred to have black. They're black. They have black blood. They have black bones. They have black cones. Many of you may know it's a yin food. It's considered it's very oily. It's considered a delicacy in China and in Southeast Asia. These are becoming harder to come by as people adopt this industrial chicken with a fat breast, very dry, which of course we have to put sauces on. Why? Because it's really inedible. The industrial chicken is not tasty. You have to add things to it. So finding alternatives to this dry white meat, which means heritage breeds, but be careful, heritage breeds are hard to come by here. It's a word that really has no legal meaning. Most of these are industrial chickens that may have different color feathers, but you have to be very careful. Let the buyer beware when you're dealing with buying heritage chickens that may be 2, 3, 4 times the price of regular industrial chicken. And just last, the sacred chicken lives on. I went to Brooklyn for the Kaparot, which where you swing the chicken around your head, it absorbs your sins. That's still a common practice. Santeria, the chicken is still important and is sacrificed as an animal that is considered to be connected to the gods. Many places in Southeast Asia, it's still considered an animal that's more than just a symbol. It really is a sacred creature. So I think there is hope that we could still maybe revive some of the respect that the ancients had for the chickens, because there are those of us who are doing it today. So ultimately, I think how we see ourselves through the chicken. And that's my goal in this book and in my research is to really use this animal because frankly, I'm not that interested in the chicken itself. I'm interested in how it interacts with us and who we are. So I think by looking at the chicken, it's a way for us to see ourselves in a fresh way. Thank you.
At first, as you mentioned, the chicken is just live with us for past and weeks, but then why they transform into some ritual symbol?
Well, that's a big question because we have very few texts that tell us anything, and all we have are a few images, and we have folklore, and we have examples such as your experience in your village. This is all speculation. Okay, there's historians can't really answer that question, but we can say that certainly the chicken was critical for early farmers because it helped them to be able to grow that rice and to not have to worry about pests and not have to worry about weeds. And I think that like the cat, I think the cat is a good example. Like the cat became a sacred animal to the Egyptians, for example, and other cultures, because it had a wild quality. It helped humanity without, like the dog, becoming domesticated. It kind of kept its own nature. So my guess is that the chicken seemed to be showing up to help these early farmers, and people appreciated that. And so they saw the chicken as a gift from the gods. And then the rooster, the issue I talked about the rooster crowing before dawn, and also the fierceness of these little Tyrannosaurus rexes, that also, I think, got people's attention. So these clearly were beings that had godlike qualities, one could say, that I think translated into treating them as sacred.
Was there a moment in writing this where you met a chicken that really changed you?
Well, I have to say, there was a moment in Bali where I had my little notebook, I'm like hanging out with the guys with their roosters and outside of a temple, and I've been just observing. I was being the good journalist. I was observing. I was taking notes. I was getting their names and what's your age, and then one of them just said, "Come on, bet." I'm like, "Bet on the chicken?" on the cockfight? He's like, yeah, yeah. And they all just kind of looked at me, and I'm like, oh God, I've got to do this. So, although but I have never done that before, and I didn't want to really break that window of observation, but I was in that kind of situation, like you're offered food that normally you don't eat, and how can you say no? So I did agree, and my rooster within like 30 seconds was dead. I guess it did change me though, because I was able to, I really, in some level I understood the excitement, and also there's a way in which these men were subverting their natural, maybe aggressive, violent tendencies through the chicken. They weren't killing each other. So I think this answers maybe that question about why the chicken was considered sacred. It's almost like they were sacrificing themselves so that we humans didn't kill each other. So I think that nature, that idea of sacrifice is common, of course, throughout all cultures. Christians have a kind of particular bead on it. But I think that really affected the way people think about this bird over the centuries. And it's one of the tragedies that we don't see now, that the chicken is still doing that for us. It is sacrificing itself by the billion, virtually every day, to feed us. And yet we certainly don't consider the chicken sacred. What does the word chicken mean in English? It means you're a coward, right? You're chicken. So we have really denigrated this animal because I think we treat it so badly, but underneath it we know that it is godlike, and that it is a gift that we've been given from nature, that we've shaped for our uses, and we should respect it.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you did your research? How you became interested in the topic? Is it funded by your company? What is your primary source of information?
Well, as I mentioned, it began as a magazine story. So it was a cover story in Smithsonian. So the story came out, it was a nightmare, frankly, because every editor wanted to get their fingers into the story about the chicken, the definitive story on the chicken. And I had to rewrite it and argue with editors, and finally it came out, and I was so sick of chicken, let me tell you. And my partner was sitting on the sofa one night, and I'd been playing around with book ideas about the evolution of human civilization. And he just looked up and said, why don't you write that book about the chicken? I was like, oh, nice idea, honey. Like you say, like you don't say, that's a stupid thing. I would never do that. That's what I'm thinking. But I said, oh, that's a nice idea, honey. And then I woke up in the middle of the night with a title, Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? It was like, that's it. And I can tell the story of human civilization through this animal that is so common, and nobody had done it. And it just seemed like a lot of fun. And as for funding, well, as in the book world, I got in advance, and I had to use that money, much of that money, to go around the world. So I got one of those cheap flights around the world. I set up visits to DNA labs in Australia, to temples in Bali, to laboratories in Vietnam. Went out in Vietnam, actually, we went with a Chinese biologist and a senior official from the Department of Agriculture. We went into northern Vietnam to look for the red jungle fowl in the wild. And we had local guides, these very cool mountain guys who knew the territory, but they would turn around and say, shh, we're walking through the jungle, and I'm like, so we didn't have any luck seeing the wild chicken, mainly because of my ineptitude. But it was great to really feel the landscape and see how they view chickens today in the villages, and as well as in places like Manila. So I just wanted to cover as much of the science and the anthropology and the religious aspects as I could. So a lot of it was archives and online searching, but the most fun part was actually getting out and talking to people, and talking to archaeologists who every day get out there and dig in the hot sun looking for that oldest chicken bone.
Thank you, Andrew, again. And
thank you very much.
Also, thanks for everyone joining us tonight.